Hi, I'm Kaylee,
And I'm Quest.
and we're going to talk about the 19th century education in America. So, what did the classroom look like?
Schools then were mainly log cabins or churches, mostly with one room. Teachers would have to teach all the grades, and there was small classroom setting, with the school mainly being one room at the time. It wasn't big enough for the average class that we have today, which is 22.
The supplies in the schools were not as fancy as the ones that we have today. They had chalkboards or slates and then chalk to write on. And the discipline was very strict. And if you stepped out of line, then it could result in detention, suspension, expulsion, and it could also be led to lashing.
Then at the time, there were no lunch provided at the school. They had to bring it from home. The only people that attended school back then were white people who could afford it. Younger girls did not go to school until a certain age because they had to work in the house with their moms. And African Americans could not afford to go to school. And on top of that, at the time, slaves were not allowed to be educated.
There were very few schools for the children who were disabled, and the teachers were required to have them in separate buildings and even separate schools. Thomas Gaudet established the very first school for the deaf in 1817.
Native Americans. Missionaries taught the Native American children on the reservation. The U.S. tried to form the Native American, especially children, to look and act like white children. This was called assimilation.
Mexican Americans. Children from Mexico had little to no opportunity to attend school, and if they did, the teachers tried to make them more like the white children, just like the Native Americans. African Americans. Black law was established to forbade schools intended to educate African Americans from other states without permission from local authorities. Black law was established because a teacher named Prudence Crandall admitted Sarah Harris to a school in Connecticut in 1830.
Before the Civil War, black code was enacted to prohibit slaves from being educated. White slave owners thought that if their slaves were educated, then it would give the slaves the idea that they could create equal rights. But we all know that everyone was created by the Lord, and we are all equal. Asian American. Asian immigrant children were few in number, but were educated. Many were Chinese parents who came to the U.S. to work for the railroad.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to continue our extensive look at American capitalism. So last week we saw how commercial farming transformed the American West and gave us mythical cowboys and unfortunately not so mythical Indian reservations. Today we leave the sticks and head for the cities, as so many Americans and immigrants have done throughout this nation's history. At the turn of the century, the population of the 23 square miles of Manhattan Island was over 2 million, and the combined 5 boroughs had a population over 4 million. But while New York gets most of the attention in this time period, and all time periods since, it wasn't alone in experiencing massive growth. Like my old hometown of Chicago, after basically burning to the ground in 1871, became the second largest city in America by the 1890s. Also, they reversed the flow of the freaking Chicago River, probably the second most impressive feat in Chicago at the time. Much of the growth had to do with the phenomenon that this period is most known for: immigration. Of course, by the end of the 19th century, immigration was not a new phenomenon in the United States. After the first wave of colonization by English people and Spanish people and other Europeans, there was a new wave of Scandinavians, French people, and especially one group of immigrants to discriminate against: the Chinese. Chinese immigrants, overwhelmingly male, had been coming to the United States, mostly to the West, since the 1850s to work in mines and on the railroads. They were viewed with suspicion because they looked different, spoke a different language, and they had strange habits like regular bathing. By the time the Chinese Exclusion Act went into effect in 1882, there were 105,000 people of Chinese descent living in the United States, mainly in cities on the West Coast. San Francisco refused to educate Asians until the state Supreme Court ordered them to do so, and even then the city responded by setting up segregated schools. The immigrants fought back through the courts. In 1886, in the case of Yik Wo versus Hopkins, the United States Supreme Court ordered San Francisco to grant Chinese-operated laundries licenses to operate. Then in 1898, in United States versus Wong Kim Ark, the court ruled that American-born children of Chinese immigrants were entitled to citizenship under the 14th Amendment, which should have been a duh, but wasn't. We've been hard on the Supreme Court here at Crash Course, but those were two good decisions. You go, Supreme Court. But despite these victories, Asian immigrants continued to face discrimination in the form of vigilante-led riots like the one in Rock Springs, Wyoming, that killed 26 people, and congressionally approved restrictions, many of which the Supreme Court did uphold. So, yeah. Also, it's important to remember that this large-scale immigration and the fear of it was part of a global phenomenon. At its peak between 1901 and the outbreak of World War I in 1914, 13 million immigrants came to the United States. In the entire period touched off by the industrialization from 1840 until 1914, a total of 40 million people came to the U.S. Points out that most immigrants to America were coming for the most obvious reason: opportunity. Industrialization, both in manufacturing and agriculture, meant that there were jobs in America. There was so much work, in fact, that companies used labor recruiters who went to Europe to advertise opportunities. Plus, the passage was relatively cheap, provided you were only going to make it once in your life, and it was fast, taking only 8 to 12 days on the new steam-powered ships. The Lower East Side of Manhattan became the magnet for waves of immigrants, first Germans, then Eastern European Jews and Italians who tended to recreate towns and neighborhoods within blocks and sometimes single buildings. Tenements, these 4-, 5-, and 6-story buildings that were designed to be apartments, sprang up in the second half of the 19th century, and the earliest ones were so unsanitary and crowded that the city passed laws requiring a minimum of light and ventilation. And often these tenement apartments doubled as workspaces because many immigrant women and children took in piecework, especially in the garment industry. Despite local laws mandating the occasional window and outlawing the presence of cows on public streets, conditions in these cities were pretty bad. Things got a little bit better with the construction of elevated railroads and later subways that helped relieve traffic congestion, but they created a new problem: pickpockets.
So, the important people that were involved in the development of education. The first one was James Pillant. He created the blackboard in 1801. He helped save money on paper and ink because it was so expensive back then. The board helped a teacher explain stuff in class instead of going to each student and to explain it to them. And then Horace Mann was the Secretary of Education, and he made great strides in lengthening the school year.
During different events during the 19th century with education was that the 10th Amendment was put into place and allowed the state to have authority over the educational system. And the right for school districts to function administratively and to implement taxes started in the 19th century as well.
The ideals that came about in the 19th century for education. The first one was conservationism, and it was a commitment to traditional values and ideas with opposition to change and innovation. The second one was liberalism. This one was the holding of liberal views. And then The last one was Romanticism, which was the movement in the arts and literature that originated in the late 18th century and emphasized inspiration, subjectivity, and the primacy of the individual.
Good morning, history class, and today I will be teaching you the history of education. I'll be focusing in America. Now, mainly I'll be looking from 1800 to 1850 in the early century. So I want you to travel with me all the way from Kamloops all the way over to St. Louis in America. This is where it all started. Now that we're in St. Louis, we are focusing on the first schoolhouse that opened in 1808. It was a one-room schoolhouse. More states followed, like Georgia, but their public schools started to close in the 1800s because children often had to work to support their family. Also at this time, it was illegal to educate a slave. So unfortunately, education was out of reach for many children at this time. Alright, so in 1800, the Protestant Religious Revival Movement, also known as the Second Great Awakening, launched a reformed movement that focused on a push for mandatory, free, public education, focusing on traditional school subjects and moral principles. All right, now take a trip with me again from St. Louis all the way over to Massachusetts, where this guy, Horace Mann, he was the Secretary of Education in Massachusetts, and he began reforming the state's school system. He focused on creating Common Core standards within the schools. He created grade levels, and also mandatory attendance. And his goal was to create a virtuous, educated voter. Now, many other states had copied Mann's state school system, and by 1870, all states had locally tax-paid public schools, although attendance was not required. And at this time, only half the girls attended by the mid-19th century. All right, now it's time to travel all the way from Massachusetts back to Kamloops. And this concludes the education history of early 19th century in America. Thanks for listening.
So, some fun facts. The first one in 1821, the first public high school was founded in Boston, and it was called Boston English High School. And then in 1856, the first kindergarten in the United States was started in Watertown, Wisconsin, and was founded.
At the time, school teachers were mainly women because the men stayed back and worked in the field with their sons. No one really drove to school at that time, and if they did, it was the wealthy family. Mostly everyone either got dropped off or walked to school. And it were different schools for different subjects and or grades. We hope that you learned something new about the education in the 19th century.